1960s started with horsepower climbing above 400 and wouldn't go much higher, even though engines would continue to get bigger. So if horsepower leveled out, why do we view the decade as the pinnacle of power? A couple of reasons. First and foremost being the epic climb in the decade before and the quick decline in the decade that followed. But there are other reasons as well. One of those reasons being big block torque. The big luxury car engines of the period were not performance engines exactly. They were made for effortless cruising on regular gasoline. Effortless in the sense of carrying heavy loads up mountain roads, because trucks were for farmers, and quite frankly were not equipped for it. And by the end of the decade, this included such monsters as Cadillac's 472 cubic inch 7.7 liter V8, introduced in 1968 with 375 horsepower and 525 pound-feet of torque. But for the wealthy, the smaller personal luxury coupes was where the power was. Cars aimed at celebrity playboys, such as the restyled Thunderbird of 1961 with its 390 cubic inch 300 horsepower V8. In 1963, the Riviera became the Thunderbird's first real competitor, and the first generation ended in 1965 with a 340 horsepower 425 cubic inch V8, and the second generation the following year started with a 430 cubic inch with 360 horsepower and 475 pound-feet of torque, soon to be followed by the front-wheel drive Toronado, itself with 425 cubic inches, 385 horsepower, and 475 pound-feet of torque, enough to move the monstrous front-wheel drive coupe to 60 in less than 10 seconds. Also, there was the growing trend of sharing engines among divisions, particularly at Ford and Chrysler. Chrysler engines such as the Cross Ram 413, once reserved for cars like the Imperial and 300, were now available in Dodge and Plymouth models with up to 420 horsepower, inspiring such songs as Shut You Down and The Little Old Lady from Pasadena, who had a brand new shiny superstock Dodge. Suddenly, Ford, Chevy, and Plymouth were top contenders in the horsepower race, starting with cars like the Chevrolet Impala 409 Supersport of 1961 with 360 horsepower, and the Ford Galaxy XL 427, or Extra Lively, of 1963 that would have 425 horsepower. Pontiac even offered a 421 Super Duty in the lightweight Grand Prix starting in 1962 with 405 horsepower. And not only was horsepower no longer limited to luxury brands, it was no longer limited to big cars. Almost immediately after the mid-size market came into being, it evolved into the muscle car. That meant dropping a tri-power 389 with up to 348 horsepower into the mid-sized Pontiac Tempest to create the GTO, the car that would become the basis for which all muscle cars would be judged, and would end the decade with a Ram Air 400 with 370 horsepower and 445 pound-feet of torque. Soon it was joined by the much milder Cutlass 442, or 4-barrel 4-speed dual exhaust, essentially a police package Cutlass 331 V8 with 310 horsepower and a Muncie 4-speed manual. It was good for 0 to 60 in 7.5 seconds and the quarter mile in 15.5. And by 1968, the 442 was up to 455 cubic inches, and there was a Hurst Olds package that would get you similar performance but with an automatic transmission. With up to 390 horsepower, the car was capable of a 5.5 second 0 to 60 and the quarter mile in about 14 flat on skinny polyglass tires. Buick started with an even milder Skylark GS, which soon was offered as the GS 400, which was introduced with 325 horsepower and 425 pound-feet of torque, but quickly climbed up to 350 horsepower and 440 pound-feet of torque. The Chevelle Supersport started with a 220 horsepower 283, but soon was offered as a Supersport 327, available in 250, 300, and 350 horsepower versions, followed shortly thereafter by a Super Sport 396 with 375 horsepower. Ford's Thunderbolt already had the 427 crammed into the mid-sized Fairlane, but soon Ford was offering more streetable versions, such as the GT, GTA, and XL, typically with a 335 horsepower 390, but there were some XLs with a 425 horsepower 427, soon to be followed with the 335 horsepower 428 Cobra Jet in 1968, which we will come back to later. And of course Mercury would have their own versions as the Cyclone and Cyclone Spoiler. Plymouth would have the Belvedere satellite-based GTX and Roadrunner. Dodge would have the RT and Super B versions of the Coronet, as well as the Charger, even if they were a bit late to the party. Base engine was typically a 330 horsepower 383, but the 440 could be had with up to 390 horsepower in 1969 with the 6-pack. And of course, there was the revived Hemi, now up to 426 cubic inches and 425 horsepower. Even the compact market would get in on the horsepower race from the get-go, with such things as the Hyper Pack 170 Slant 6 Valiant with 148 horsepower, or the turbocharged version of the Corvair with 150, which would be up to 180 for the second generation. And soon even this segment would be offering V8s, such as the 164 horsepower 260 V8 from the Fairlane being offered in the Falcon Sprint, or a 273 V8 in the Dart GT with 180 horsepower. A turbo was even offered on the 215 V8 of Oldsmobile in a version of the F85 Cutlass called the Jetfire, with 215 horsepower and 300 pound-feet of torque. Studebaker's Lark, however, started the decade with a 259 cubic inch V8. It had 195 horsepower and was capable of a 0 to 60 in 10 seconds, or about half what the compacts from the Big Three could do in 1960. Soon they would move to a 289 V8 with 225 horsepower, and by 1963, that V8 would be supercharged in the R2 versions with 290 horsepower. Soon, sportier spin-offs of the compact market would start to appear, such as the Plymouth Barracuda and Ford Mustang. And by the end of the decade, even these smaller cars would have monster motors. The Mustang would lead the way with cars such as the Shelby GT500 with the 428 Cobra Jet with up to 360 horsepower. And later, the Mustang and Cougar would get their own version of a Hemi V8 with the 429 Boss, rated at 375 horsepower and 450 pound-feet of torque. At first, Chevy competed in this market with the Chevy Tomb Novas, with cars such as the 250 to 350 horsepower 327 Super Sport. But the Camaro arrived in 1967 and would have a 325 horsepower 396 Super Sport variant. And Pontiac would have the Formula 400 Firebird, which produced up to 345 horsepower and 430 pound-feet of torque. Dodge, of course, had its Dart with the top GTS versions, which started with a 275 horsepower 340, moving up to a 300 horsepower 383, and the smaller and sportier Plymouth Barracuda offered up to a 375 horsepower 440 in street trim. And then there was the Corvette, which started the decade with the same 283 it had been using since 1957, but moved up to a 327 in 1962, which had up to 360 horsepower in fuel-injected form. In 1965, the top engine was a 425 horsepower 396, and in 1967, the L88 427 would offer 430. And of course, the lack of restrictions at the time allowed all kinds of special order cars and dealer packages, such as 427 Novas and Hemi Coronet sedans. And supposedly, there was some sort of a gentleman's agreement by the end of the decade putting a 425 horsepower cap on cars, which might explain why many top models were rated at exactly that. But the truth is that horsepower figures were often not all that accurate to begin with, and were often fudged intentionally, both up and down, particularly on homologation specials, depending on where they wanted the number to land based on what sort of event they wanted it to qualify for. Ford's 428 Cobra Jet, for example, is considered one of Ford's most powerful engines, but was typically only rated at 335 horsepower gross, while there are claims that it is dyno tested at well above 400. Other cars that were trying to focus more on luxury over performance, such as many Buicks, had their horsepower underrated to keep insurance premiums down. But by the end of the decade, power-robbing accessories such as power steering and air conditioning were becoming commonplace, so naturally, it wouldn't be long until gross ratings were replaced by net ratings, meaning that the most powerful cars were closer to 350 horsepower or less than the 425 that they were being rated at, something that we will take a look at in our next horsepower video. As always, thanks for watching, and don't forget to comment below and like and subscribe.